Good evening, and welcome to tonight's John A. Widtsoe Foundation virtual conversation, Church History and the World, the June 1978 Revelation on the Priesthood. I'm Richard E. Turley Jr., your host for this evening, and I want to welcome our guest, Darius Gray, a dear and longtime friend whom I'll introduce more formally in a moment. Our conversation this evening concludes the John A. Widtsoe Foundation's year-long series of discussions on the Doctrine and Covenants of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Next month begins another year-long series of conversations that parallel the church's Come Follow Me lessons, which next year focus on the Old Testament. The first program in that series will be on January the 2nd, 2022, and will be hosted by Dr. Jacob Renneker of the Foundation. It will feature a conversation on the Garden of Eden with Dr. Tamar Frankiel, an Orthodox Jew and former provost of the Academy for Jewish Religion, California. We hope you'll find time in your schedules to join the Foundation for what is sure to be an interesting conversation. I also want to remind you that this evening's conversation and all previous conversations in this series are available at the John A. Widtsoe Foundation website, www.widtsoefoundation.org. We always broadcast live and record each session as we do so, and it takes about a week after each broadcast for the recording to find itself onto the Foundation's website. Now let me introduce our guest for this evening. Darius A. Gray was trained in broadcast journalism with degrees from the University of Utah and Columbia University. He worked for KSL Radio and Television in Salt Lake City during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Darius says he especially enjoyed documentary film production and was privileged to be placed on loan to UNICEF for the purpose of filming grassroots aid projects in several African countries. More recently, he also participated in the highly acclaimed PBS family history series Ancestors, produced by KBYU Television, and was involved in the KUED documentary, Utah's African American Voices. He is also the co-author of an award-winning trilogy of novels about early Black Mormon pioneers entitled Standing on the Promises. Welcome, Darius.
Hello, and thank you, Brother Turley, my friend.
Now let's turn to the subject of our conversation, the June 1978 Revelation on the Priesthood, that is published as Official Declaration 2 of the Doctrine and Covenants of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. As we begin this conversation, we'd like to remind you of the format for these programs. We'll begin with a discussion between Darius and me on the topic. I will start with some questions to get the conversation rolling. Meanwhile, we invite you as audience members to write down your own questions as they come to you and submit them to us on whatever program you're using to listen to this conversation. We'll begin addressing your questions about half or two-thirds of the way through the hour. I want to say as well that unlike with previous conversations in this series in which we have had to finish the conversation strictly within the hour, tonight we may go a few minutes over the 60-minute boundary if the conversation requires it. Now, without further ado, let's launch into tonight's subject. Darius, tell us a little bit about your background and how you came to join the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yeah, I know it's going to sound familiar to Latter-day Saints, but having been born of goodly parents, I was born and raised in Colorado Springs, Colorado, of God-fearing parents. My mom very active in the Church of God in Christ, Pentecostal, and Dad a member of the it's a denomination not much known of, but it's the Black Episcopal Church, and where Dad only attended once a year, and Mom attended every Sunday. But we were raised in a warm, loving family, my sisters and I feel very, very fortunate for that. It was in the days where indeed it took a neighborhood, a village to raise a child. Everyone knew everyone who lived on the block, and everyone looked out for everyone else. And it was interesting in that one side of the block was primarily African American, and the other side was primarily Caucasian, and you had a blend on both ends. And so we grew up playing, I grew up playing with a lot of kids of German extraction, the Kellers, the Wolbers, the Bees, and I could go over and eat cabbage at Elmer's house, and he could come over and have mustard greens at mine. So it was a lovely upbringing, lovely upbringing. My parents gifted me my first set of scriptures when I think I was 7, and I still have a Bible. And back in the day, we didn't have marking pens as we do, and so it was just pencil. But I undertook to read the scriptures and to learn what was therein. And so I've always known Christ. I've always known God. It was nothing foreign to me. And I am so grateful for that. Growing up in that Black church that did not have all of the resources that we have in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the manuals and whatnot, but sitting in a pew with Sister Sims as our teacher and just reading from the Word. I'm very grateful for that upbringing. So that was the beginning, and I'll stop and let you ask another question.
At what point did you first become aware of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints?
I had left home, had gone to the West Coast and lived and worked there for a brief period of time, and returned home in the summer of 1964 to my mom's home. Dad had died, the girls were gone, and so when I arrived, Mom and I were chatting, and she told me of a new family in the neighborhood. She said they're a white family, but they seem awfully nice. And she said they had a whole slew of kids. And I think it was the next day I was walking around the block with my friend Butch, and we passed in front of that home. And as we did, the kids, the 5 Felix children, were out playing in the yard, and they came running up to the gate, threw it open, and their first words were, "You're Aiden," and my middle name, "and we're the Felixes. We're Mormons, you know." And seriously, that is a quote. And I had thought of Mormons like Mennonites or Quakers, and here they were, kids in summer togs and shorts and whatnot. And my response was, "The hell do you say?" And that was the beginning. I met the parents the same day. I think they both were home at the time, John and Barbara Felix. And that's when I first became aware of a Latter-day Saint family. And it was a marvelous experience. They were very warm, very engaging, very open. And that was the beginning of my journey.
At some point, you came face to face with a set of missionaries. How did that happen?
The Felixes were good missionaries, but more than that, they were good friends, good neighbors. And the comfort level is hard to convey. It was a place where you just gravitated, and you wanted to be there and drop by every day or two, and you were welcome to and invited to. And yet, as good missionaries, they gave me a copy of the Book of Mormon, which I did not read. And I think they cheated because they started asking questions from the book. And so I felt obligated to read. And in those readings, some questions were prompted. And it got to the point where the Felixes felt that they couldn't answer all of my questions. And they suggested I meet with the missionaries. And that's where things kind of took the first turn. Again, Mom was very active in her faith. She had friends of different religious backgrounds, and it was not at all uncommon to have people in our home where they would be sharing and discussing religion, not debating, not arguing, but just sharing. And so that's what I saw. And so when I had questions of these missionaries, I told Mom that I wanted to have them come to the house. And she was agreeable. And they came, I believe, only one time. And Mom did not want to participate. She stayed in her bedroom off of the living room with the door partially closed so she could hear but not be present. And after the missionaries had finished that first lesson, Mom called my name, and I went in and she said, I don't want those two young men back here. Well, why not? This is my house and I don't want them in here. Do you understand me? The only answer was, yes, ma'am. And it took a few days to find out what the issue was. But before we kids had come along, Mom conveyed that she had been home one day and two young men came to the door and wanted to know if they could talk to her about their faith, their church. And she had invited them in, and in short order, one of them said, excuse me, Mrs. Gray, but are you Negro or do you have Negroid blood? And Mom was a blend of Native American and African American. And these young men from wherever weren't sure what they were saying. But Mom's response was, yes, of course. I have, African American blood, Negro blood. And it was at that point that they made a very hasty exit. And Mom did not want me, her only son, to become involved with what she thought of as a racist church.
So what happened next?
I had had a taste of truth in reading of the Book of Mormon. And that first discussion, seeing the life of the Felixes, and really that is not to be discounted. To see a family with 3 daughters and 2 sons, and typical family, they had issues one with another, but the love superseded everything. I had had a taste. And so I made arrangements to proceed. And I can't even remember for sure. I think a couple of times I may have met with the missionaries at the Felix home. But it came down to having a date set for my baptism, which was to be on December 26th, 1964. And so that was a Saturday. Christmas Day, 25th, was on Friday. And I actually met with the missionaries at their apartment. And I think that's likely highly unusual, but they weren't going to go to my mom's home and didn't want to impose on the Felix family Christmas Day. So I had driven over to the apartment of these 2 missionaries, and we all 3 sat on a single sofa, sort of staggered so we could see one another. And they were asking all of the questions. I had been a smoker, and they were asking if I had quit smoking, and alcohol had never been an issue. And did I have any questions? Did I believe in God the Father and in Jesus Christ, His Son? Those sorts of things. And so I was answering all the appropriate way as far as they needed to hear. And they said, well, Brother Gray, do you have any questions? And I said, yes, I do. And I had raised a question earlier in the discussions, and I was told, well, we'll get to that later. Well, now, the night before what was to have been my scheduled baptism, later had arrived. And so I posed it again. And I said, in talking about the Book of Mormon, there are a number of groups of people, different tribes, apparent ethnicities, and you have some who are dark-skinned and some light-skinned, and the dark-skinned ones often are out of favor with God. And so my question was, pointing to my own hand, how, if in any way, does that relate to me? Is there any connection that way? And one of the missionaries got up and left the sofa and walked over to the corner, and it was sort of like putting himself in the dunce corner is how I felt. I knew something was coming. And the senior missionary there said, well, Brother Gray, the primary implication is that you won't be able to hold the priesthood. And that's a direct quote. And went on to explain that it was because of my race. And I don't remember anything else that was said. I tuned off. I felt foolish. Remembering my mother's attitude towards the young men that she had encountered. I felt like someone who had taken candy from a stranger and was now where one ought not to be. And I was a proud young Black man in 1964 America. I had been raised by goodly parents. We had been taught to be proud of our family, proud of ourselves, and to conduct ourselves in an appropriate way in society, and not to take a back seat to anyone, not to be bodacious, but to be comfortable in our own skin. And to have these two young men tell me that I was cursed and less than. And I did not express to them how I felt, but I thought, there's no way in hell I'm going to be joining that church tomorrow. And so I left, drove home, was totally undone. I let Mom know I was back in the house. Couldn't talk to her. She had given me her warning, and I didn't want to say, guess what, Mom? I thought about going over to the Felixes. I didn't know who to trust. Did they feel about me and others of my race as apparently these young men did, and as the church they were telling me did? And so I just let Mom know I was home, and I went to my room and got ready for bed. So what happened? My bed was a converted sleeping porch and didn't have any heating directly into it, no vent, heat vent. There was one in the kitchen adjacent to, but this is December, Colorado Springs, over 6,000 feet in altitude. It gets cold. And so my method of having prayer in the summer or winter would be to get in bed, and especially in the winter, get under the homemade quilts. And my bed slid right up against the wall and to the level of the windowsill. And Mom had made some homemade curtains, and Dad had found a brass rod, and the curtain just slid on that brass rod, and I would just push the curtain to the side, the window slid open, and whatever the season of the year, I would rest on that sill and look up at the night sky, and that's where I had prayer. And I did that this night, and I don't remember what I said. I just know that I was in turmoil, and closed the prayer, closed the window, closed the curtain. Could not go to sleep. Ultimately, I repeated the process, and I opened everything and entered into prayer a second time. And looking at that night sky, I heard, "This is the restored gospel, and you are to join." Nothing more. I did not see God the Father, did not see Jesus Christ, no angels were apparent, but I heard, this is the restored gospel, and you are to join. So on that night, December 25th, 1964, I went to sleep, went the next day to my baptism with no member of my family there. Very few people from the ward there. I remember the woman who was to play the piano, provide the music, didn't show up. And yeah, I had had music lessons. So here I am trying to play by sight this foreign song, for my own baptism. The Felix family members were there, but I was baptized on December 26, 1964, which, if I'm remembering today's date, looking at the calendar, is about 7 days or 8 days from now. 8 days from now, I will have completed my 57th year, and Lord willing, undertake my 58th.
That is a remarkable story, and each time I hear you tell it, I feel a rush of spiritual strength and confirmation.
57 years later, so do I. I've had other spiritual experiences, and I can count them and name them, but nothing like that. That was the seminal moment. I've not heard that voice again. I felt the presence, but I've not heard that voice again. And it has been what's carried me through. In those 57 years, there were times when I tired of the struggle, to put it directly. And I became inactive, what I call going on walkabout. I didn't lose my testimony, but I just couldn't deal with the societal pressures within and outside the church, more so within. But I couldn't leave. I couldn't deny what I heard that December night. So, yeah.
How old were you at the time?
Oh, I lie about my age, and if I told you that, you'd be able to easily compute my age. I'm, let's say I'm. What benefits if I say I'm older than I look or younger than I look? Anyway, I was a young man, and I have been blessed. Rick, you know me. It has been a journey the likes of which I could not have imagined, did not imagine. The things that Father has put in front of me to experience, to challenge me, some greater than I thought I was capable of doing, and I was right. Others where I felt uplifted to get it done, but it has been a remarkable journey. And I'm in my twilight, and we all face that ultimate passing. And all I can do is stand in amazement at what Father has offered me and brought me.
It would be from the time of your baptism, 13 and a half years before the June 78 revelation. That's the topic of our conversation this evening. What was it like being a person of African descent in the church before June of 1978?
I'm glad that we're touching on that. I would imagine that the vast majority of those listening and watching this weren't alive or old enough in June of 78 to really have a sense of what it was like. And I often heard, well, it just meant that you weren't able to preside and you didn't have the priesthood. No, That's not what I meant. There was that, but that is not to be discounted. For those who have been able to join the Aaronic priesthood at the age of 12 and to progress and whatnot through the orders of the priesthood, it may seem, well, that was nothing. Well, when it's unavailable to you, and it is available to others, and because it's unavailable to you, and because of some of the false teachings that were around, blacks were less valiant in the pre-existence, false. Blacks were fence sitters, less unwilling to support God, false. Because Cain killed Abel, blacks weren't allowed to hold the priesthood. All of these things that were taught and believed by the majority, it appears, I didn't take a poll sampling, but it affected how people viewed persons of color. It was like being a leper, as the closest I can equate to. Yes, it's nice to see Brother Gray here, but it's at arm's length. And being a young man, and whatever the youth programs were back then, I can't even remember. I remember one Saturday, whatever the youth program was in the ward, we were in the cultural hall, and after whatever was scheduled was done, everyone decided to go for pizza, and people started pairing off this guy, that young lady, this young that guy. And all of a sudden, it's like being chosen to be on a basketball team or not, And I could see, okay, it's going to wind up being one young lady and me. And when she saw that happen, I could see that headache coming on. Oh, I've got this terrible headache. And just knowing that your presence was enough of a negative that someone would feign headache so as not to appear to be with you. Later, ward temple outing, great to hear about, and you'd love to go, but it didn't include you. It was not just uncomfortable, it was demeaning. It was denying your humanity, that you weren't equal to other of God's children. You were less than. When others were taught that you were cursed. It's like being a leper.
At some point, you make a decision to go to Brigham Young University. Tell us what led to that decision and what it was like when you first got there.
Well, just like the Felix family, tired of my questions and passed me on to the missionaries, everyone tired of my questions and suggested I go to BYU, where they would have all the answers. So while I was baptized in December of '64, I arrived in Provo, Utah in June of '65. And as best I can tell, there were 4 or 5 Nigerians who had been encouraged to attend the Y in April, May of that year, '65. And there was a Afro-Panamanian couple that arrived in May. And then there was this black kid from Colorado who arrived in June. And possibly that same month, I don't know when she arrived, there was an African-American young woman from Cleveland. And so out of student body in excess of 20,000, there were 2 African-Americans and a small group of Nigerians who luckily I heard of. They were the mystery people. And finally I was told that one of the members worked in janitorial services and was in the HVAC the Harris Fine Arts Building and there at night. And so I went looking for him and found him. And they were very warm. I had several meals with them, and it was just nice to see someone else of color. I found that if I walked around campus, I had to smile. Again, I stood out and people didn't know what I was. And so I had people coming up and speaking Spanish to me, thinking I was Hispanic or in Portuguese. And it was just interesting. Interesting time there. I have, I think, a partially correct and a partially false memory. The Wilkinson Center, the Student Union building, had just been dedicated, I believe, and they were showing the first film in the Varsity Theater. And people, as I was walking on campus, would tell me, hey, they're having a film on civil rights. And it's going to be at the Varsity Theater and you ought to go see it. And so I showed up on the given time and day. And when the film came up, I thought it was the major film, but apparently it was just sort of a lead-in film. But it came on the screen, Civil Riots, RIOTS, a production of the John Birch Society. And it was basically putting all workers in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King and others, as communists. And I sat there as far as I could tell, the lone black face in that audience. Yeah, those were interesting times, Rick.
When you were experiencing things as you've just described, what feelings did you have?
Insecurity is the first thing that comes to mind. It was sort of like that night when I was told I wouldn't be able to hold the priesthood the night before my baptism, not knowing if every Latter-day Saint felt about Blacks the way I was perceiving they might, how the Felixes might feel, and not, other than what I had seen, which was loving and warm and inviting and nurturing and support. But it was, who are these people? Who are these people? To be invited to a film that I thought was going to be uplifting and supportive of the civil rights movement, which was underway in the mid-60s, and then to encounter that. And I don't want to dwell on the negative, but the negative was real. The positives were real. I lived on $19 a month. I had an annuity coming from my deceased father, and it was $69 a month. Well, when I had been home or elsewhere and working, I would give half of my money to Mom for the betterment of the household. And so here I was away from home. I sent her by money order $50 of the $69 every month. So I had $19 to live on. Didn't have money for books. There was a young woman, and I honestly can't remember her real name, but I used to have this habit of calling people by the name they looked like. And to me, she looked like a Mickey. And so I'd call her Mickey. We shared a couple of classes together, and she had books. And so sometimes we would study. There was this one evening where she had been studying where I lived, which was at the back of the Mexico studio, photo studio. And it was a supply loft that I'd been allowed by the Gomez family to sleep on, because you don't have very good housing on $19 a month total income. And at any rate, so we were sitting there, and the weather was good, and there were some decorative little windows that were open with no screening. And as I looked out, there was a police car, a squad car, sitting there at the corner of 3rd West and Center Street. And I thought he was trying to catch someone speeding going up and down Center. but every time I looked out, he was looking up at the window where she and I were. Well, okay, that's strange. Anyway, it came time for her to go, and I was going to walk her home. And again, from 3rd West, she lived up on 9th East. And so we went walking up 9th East from 1st North, and that patrol car was 20 feet, 15 feet behind. And if we were walking at 2 miles an hour, that patrol car was behind us at 2 miles an hour until I got her home. It sent me a message. How did I feel? Insecure.
These are gripping experiences that you're describing, and I'm glad that you have done so. That was my hope in inviting you here as a guest. Let me now fast forward to June of 1978 and read a portion of Declaration 2. Aware of the promises made by the prophets and presidents of the church who have preceded us, that at some time in God's eternal plan, all of our brethren who are worthy may receive the priesthood, and witnessing the faithfulness of those from whom the priesthood has been withheld, and that includes you, of course. We have pleaded long and earnestly in behalf of these, our faithful brethren, spending many hours in the upper room of the temple, supplicating the Lord for divine guidance. He has heard our prayers, and by revelation has confirmed that the long-promised day has come, when every faithful, worthy man in the church may receive the holy priesthood with power to exercise its divine authority, and enjoy with his loved ones every blessing that flows therefrom, including the blessings of the temple. Accordingly, all worthy male members of the church may be ordained to the priesthood without regard for race or color. When did you first become aware of this statement?
I was a manager in a Fortune 500 company, Zellerbach Paper Company, a division of Crown Zellerbach Corporation. Had joined that company in Portland, Oregon, and had been then transferred back to Salt Lake City, a place I did not want to return to. And in fact, I was offered, it was a promotion. And I told my boss in Portland, if I can find a position between now and the day I'm to report in Salt Lake City, I'll be leaving the company. And yet I had determined to make it my future. Great opportunity. Well, I didn't have a job come, and so I arrived back here. But I was sitting in my office on that June 8th day, and a credit assistant by the name of Dixie Baker. And Dixie was a dear soul, but she was not subtle. That was not her strong point. And Dixie, if you're listening and alive, or if you're listening and not alive, I'm telling the truth. And she stuck her head in my open door. Hey, Darius, I hear they're going to give the Negroes the priesthood. Sensitive subject. And I said, Dixie, that's not funny. Get out of here. And it irritated me. And she stayed at the door and repeated it. And this time I swore at her. And I said, that is not funny. And she said, well, look, I've been on the phone to the LDS Church, and they were our largest customer. And there's a rumor going on that the priesthood is going to be given. She continued to unravel this story. And as I listened, I thought it can't be, but it might be. I thought there would not be an answer to that priesthood restriction or a change until the second coming, Rick. And this was just out of the blue. There was no hint, no conversation sort of hitting around anywhere that was likely to happen. And so as I listened to Dixie, she started to convince me. I had a little television and a radio both in my office. and I turned them on thinking that anything of that magnitude would catch airtime, and there was nothing on either. And so I did, to me, the logical thing. I picked up the phone and called President Kimball's office. And it was logical because prior to working at Crown Zellerback Corporation, I had worked in broadcast journalism at KSL, which is owned, the station is owned by the church. And I was known to the brethren and had interacted with them. So it wasn't that much of a reach. And so I called and identified myself and was patched through to President Kimball's secretary. And I said what my purpose was, and I was told that President Kimball had just gone back over to the temple. But it was confirmed to me that yes, yes, disbelief. My immediate supervisor at Zellerback was a Latter-day Saint, and Jim and I were going to go out to the airport to pick up the fellow who had been my office mate in the Portland office of Zellerback Paper Company. And so on the way out to the airport, now it was hitting the airwaves, and heard it on the car radio. Picked up Jack Taylor, my former office mate, and Jack recounted the story of while they were in the air, the pilot came on the intercom and said that the Mormon Church had just announced that priesthood was going to be available to all worthy males. It was that kind of story, that much of a magnitude. And I know of one other case with a friend, Kathy Stokes, who was midway between the continental United States and Hawaii, where it was announced mid-flight that this had happened. So that's how I heard. On the way back in from the airport, going to the office, the Zellerback office, we stopped off at Temple Square, and dumb move, because all of a sudden here comes the media. There's a black guy, we got to talk to him. And what I wanted to do, though, there was the head of public affairs, as we have called it. I'm not sure what the official term was, but a gentleman by the name of Heber Woolsey. And Heber and I, over the years, had been assigned by the brethren to go speak to certain groups, to answer questions if we would. And Heber was marvelous at it because he didn't pull any punches. He was honest. He was just straightforward. Here's what we believe. Here's what we know. Here's what we don't know. And it was an interesting time, but I wanted to share that moment, that event with Heber Woolsey, who is no longer with us. And went to his office, and he had left for home after having announced the revelation to the media. And so his secretary said, let me call him. And he just slipped up in the avenues. And Heber quickly came back down. And I remember standing there in his office on whatever floor, and then the office building. And we overlooked the Salt Lake Temple. And we were just holding on to each other, embraced, and tears just flowing down our faces. And just saying the world will never be the same. And remember thinking, not only does this affect the current, it affects the future. And it also affected the past. We do temple work for the deceased, as you know. And in the past, when extraction of names from various public records took place and the individuals were seen to be of African descent, their names were not sent to the temple for proxy work. They were held in abeyance. And now with what occurred on June 8th, 1978, those names could be taken out of the pot and run through the various temples and have those blessings received by people who had been waiting and waiting. The world has not been the same.
What was the impact on you personally? That is, how did this begin to affect your life as an individual member of the church and a person of African descent?
It took some doing. The one habit that I had that the missionaries asked me about, the smoking, I had gone back to smoking. And so I needed to rid myself of that again. And I'm sure this is going to sound pompous as all get out, but I take very seriously holding the priesthood of God. It didn't come easily. It wasn't just automatic and something my buddies did, around me. And I know I'm being demeaning to members, and I apologize. But I've listened to men who hold the priesthood say, I believe the church is true. I believe that we have the restored God. And I didn't have that priesthood. And I know the church is true. I valued that priesthood. I didn't want to do anything to sully it. I wanted to do my best to be worthy to carry it. So it took a little bit of me getting my head right before I could say, yes, I'm ready. This is hard, brother.
And I deeply appreciate your willingness to do this in such a candid and straightforward manner.
I haven't talked about this in an awfully long time.
So you have now been a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints longer in the period after this revelation than before. What has your life been like during those years since then?
My life was blessed before. My life has been blessed following. God is no respecter of persons. He has been as generous as he was before with just new opportunities and new responsibilities. I've been able to, for those who are of our faith, attending the temple is a commitment to do service for others. You just don't go in and say, gee, I was at the temple. You're acting as proxy. I've been able to be proxy for a number of, a whole slew of folks. And in the process, I've grown. Listening to the words of the various, I'll say, ceremonies that occur in the temple, I've grown. I've gained in perspective. I'm one of those guys that prior to COVID, I was an active temple attendee. I find peace there. I find communion with my fellow Latter-day Saints and with our God there. I've not attended the temple since the outbreak of COVID, and I have some health issues that make me a bit more reticent than others. I have been vaccinated and I've had my booster, and I'm thinking seriously, how safe is it? But I'd like to be able to get back to the temple. It is a very personal uplifting, reassuring opportunity to give back.
Now, a question relating to your comment about the revelation changing not only the present, but also the past and the future. The John A. Widtsoe Foundation likes to focus on the global church. What impact has this revelation had on the church globally?
I should have pulled those numbers up, and I won't fumble around with them on my computer. A couple of years ago, I think maybe 3 years ago, I was asked to do a presentation for a new organization at BYU, the Black Alumni Association. And I called down to headquarters to get data on the number of members in Africa specifically. And if I'm remembering correctly, it was close to 750,000 members there. And that was about 3 years ago, maybe 4. And that's significant in that going back to 1965 and 66, I encountered a gentleman who worked for the church, Lamar Williams, Brother Lamar Williams, who had an assignment from the First Presidency in the Quorum of the 12, and journeyed to Nigeria and interacted with some of the saints there. I encountered Brother Williams, and he became a good close associate during those early days. And I asked him at one point, how many Black members are there worldwide, globally? And he said, well, if you count, the United States and Canada and the Caribbean and the mixtures that we have in Brazil and the rest of South and Central America, it was estimated that there were 300 to 400 worldwide total. And so here we are with 750,000 on one continent. And the church growing there faster now than it was 3 or 4 years ago. I without going down too many rabbit trails here, I wound up on a trip to Africa in 1970, and I was so eager. I had hoped to live and work on the African continent. And had taken classes in business with that thought in mind. And at any rate, first country, Ethiopia, second country, Kenya. And I thought before I left, the night before I left, there was a Sterling Scholar program at the Hotel Utah, which is now the Joseph Smith building. And the first presidency was there. And Joseph Fielding Smith presiding. And Harold B. Lee, I believe, was first counselor, and they approached me and said, Brother Gray, we understand you're leaving for Africa tomorrow. And I thought, boy, those jungle drums are good. Anyway, they asked me to convey their greetings to any Latter-day Saints I might meet, and to bring back any notation that those I might meet would want to have go back to the senior brethren. And so my thought was, I'm going to Black Africa. I'm going to the motherland. I'm not going to meet any Latter-day Saints. First country, Ethiopia, before I left the airport, Mormons, Latter-day Saints. Second country, Kenya. I must have arrived on a Saturday afternoon or something, and I was dealing with the African version of Montezuma's Revenge. And it was now Sunday morning, and the phone rang in my hotel room, and the voice said, Mr. Gray, and it was a Western accent. And I didn't know who it was, and I said, yes. And then there was the pause, Brother Gray? And it was the branch president of the Nairobi, Kenya branch of the church inviting me to services that day. And I explained my health issue, and he ordered some kaopectate or whatever the heck it was, and they picked me up. all of that to set the stage, I went to the branch, and I was the only person of color in the Nairobi, Kenya branch. Everyone else was an expat from either US or Europe. And now we have the general authority from Kenya. We have missionaries from Kenya who have been out around the continent and around the world. We have a temple. I believe, has that one been completed? Do you know?
I don't know.
But what has happened globally, to see it from being no person of color in a Nairobi, Kenya branch to having branches and wards, stakes, remarkable.
It truly is remarkable. It reminds me of the revelation in Acts, in which the gospel began to spread throughout the earth. This was a revelation that led to the church's beginnings of the church's globalization. And you mentioned Nairobi, Kenya. Kenya is now the center of the newest area of the church, the Africa East area, which is one of the most vibrant and fastest growing and best in terms of retention of all the areas of the church around the world. And the membership is growing rapidly there. It's growing rapidly in other areas of the world where there are people of African descent. And it's a miracle that we've seen wrought during your lifetime, and you in particular are one who has been able to witness it with a viewpoint that makes your testimony particularly authoritative. We're coming up on the hour now and haven't even touched the questions. We should probably touch a question or two here. So I'm going to put on my glasses and see if I can.
I've been pretty verbose. Sorry, brother.
No, I wish we had a very, very long time. And this first question is from someone who says, many women in the church think they might be experiencing something similar to what you have experienced. Is that a valid, or is there a difference? What advice and counsel would you have on the subject of women in priesthood ordination?
I obviously can't speak to it from direct experience because I'm not a woman, but from indirect experience, I believe that there is some efficacy to that. At times and currently, we have not always treated everyone, regardless of race or gender, equally. And yes, I think that is something to be of concern. If you're single, whether male or female, you don't fit as well because we tend to be a family-oriented church. If you are a lone woman, you don't have that partner to go with. If you're a lone man, you don't either, as we go to temple outings or whatever the social functions are. Women do not directly hold the priesthood, as you're aware. And yet they share in that priesthood, but share in it less so if they don't have a male priesthood holder in the home. So, I can understand that there are indeed issues that some encounter.
So many of these questions, as I'm glancing through them here, people share their personal experiences. This next question is that way. This questioner says, as a missionary in the South, when President Kimball's courageous revelation occurred, we were tracting and the people of the street were excited to share the news. As young idealistic elders who looked at everyone as a child of God and a possible convert, we always questioned why we didn't track those full African Americans. We immediately started to outreach those areas, the shanty towns, the public housing. We all treated that opportunity as being able to be the first to tread on what we considered sacred ground. Yes, there was some grumbling from a few old Confederates, but it was amazing to me how it was accepted and rejoiced. The racism in the LDS culture certainly was not embedded. There's not a specific question there, but I think this is a good one to raise a question that I have wanted to ask you. We know that the children of Israel wandered 40 years in the wilderness before they entered the promised land. It's now been more than 40 years since the June revelation on the priesthood. Have we entered the promised land?
I think we stepped foot into the promised land, and then we stepped back a bit.
7 p.m.
What was that?
That was my clock telling me it was 7 p.m.
Oh, thank you. Rick, we were doing very well. I would agree that the vast majority of Latter-day Saints hungered for the change that occurred in June of '78. It was uncomfortable for so many. I have some good friends now, brethren, who served missions, and they did their best to answer questions about the church's restriction on Blacks. And they feel that they were lied to, some of them, by the church. And there is some sensitivity there, because people wanted to be more inviting and inclusive. And after '78, yes, we have been. And in the main, by far as my old eyes can see, there were far more people who were thrilled at the change than there were that were opposed to it. But in recent times, without going into sensitive political and cultural areas, we've stepped back a bit. There has been political speech that has been hostile to persons of color. That speech has been embraced within our wards, our stakes, high priest group meetings, when we were high priest groups. I received calls and text messages, and I had one just a week ago, a young lady saying she doesn't feel safe in her ward anymore because of some of the attitudes that are prevalent, and the vitriolic language. So I think we were doing far better at being more as Father would have us be. And I think we've taken at least a partial step back, because that I heard maybe a week ago, I heard within a couple of other times within, say, the last 2 months, people who are not feeling as welcomed, as secure in their own home wards.
There have been recent times when church leaders have spoken about racism in the church. For example, in the October 2020 General Conference, President Russell M. Nelson made an emotional plea to listeners saying, "Each of us has a divine potential because each is a child of God. Each is equal in his eyes. The implications of this truth are profound. Brothers and sisters, please listen carefully to what I'm about to say. God does not love one race more than another. His doctrine on this matter is clear. He invites all to come unto him, black and white, bond and free, male and female. I assure you that your standing before God is not determined by the color of your skin. Favor or disfavor with God is dependent upon your devotion to God and his commandments, and not the color of your skin. I grieve that our Black brothers and sisters the world over are enduring the pains of racism and prejudice. Today, I call upon our members everywhere to lead out in abandoning attitudes and actions of prejudice. I plead with you to promote respect for all of God's children." In light of what you've described, how do you feel when you hear such statements from church leaders?
I am so uplifted by their voices. What has been said by President Nelson, President Oaks, Elder Cook, and I could go on. In our last number of general conferences. Thank you, brethren, to them. I have had some limited interaction with the brethren, and I believe fully that they are committed to having us be one family, a unified family of God, and that they are committed to that. And I'm not an easy sale. I'm a crusty old guy. I trust the senior brethren and what they're saying on this topic. They mean it. Now we need to get in line and follow it. I've also seen social media where our own members speak ill of the prophet and of members of the prophets of the Quorum of the 12 when they have spoken these things in general conference. I have copies that I've saved on my computer. Excuse me, you're listening to something that is a social view or a political view, and you are countering the brethren, the senior brethren, and the scriptures of God for that. It's frightening to me. I had an experience just a couple of days ago, and sorry for being so long-winded. And I want to say to my brothers and sisters out there who are worried about critical race theory and those sorts of things, you're being given a false object to worry about. And you are good people. And this was the spiritual experience I had on a personal level. Sometimes when you think you know what's going on, speaking of myself and of my brothers and sisters in some case, when you think you understand the dynamics, you think you understand the issues, you may not. And you may subscribe to something wrongly. And in so doing, it can cause great harm for you and for others. For my fellow Latter-day Saints, my fellow Christians who are being more hostile towards persons of color, not just Blacks, but Hispanics, Asians, stop. You're being deceived. You may think you understand the issues going on. You're being lied to. No. Follow the scriptures. Read the scriptures. Follow the promptings of the Holy Ghost. Let those be your guide. Much is at stake. You are good people. You mean well. You want to see things go positively, but you're heading down a path that is negative. Change up.
We still have a lot of unanswered questions that we won't be able to get to, but I think I've read through them. I want to summarize them because as I've read through them, they seem to be a couple of themes. One theme has to do with LGBTQ plus people experiencing what they should not be experiencing. Do you want to say anything about that?
I was invited a number of years ago to be an advisor to an LGBTQ group affirmation here. A support group from the Latter-day Saints who were LGBTQ identified and the church. And it was a marvelous experience for me. I have learned a lot. Those are our brothers and sisters, and they're not our half brothers and sisters. They're not the redheaded stepchild. They are us. We are them. We don't need to put an "ite," make them an "ite." They are children of the same God as we. I am happy to say that I am an ally, and I support my brothers and sisters of a different sexual orientation. Grateful for their own strength, for their courage to withstand the issues that have confronted them. Yeah, I'm not only an ally, I'm a friend and I'm a brother.
Thank you. And many of the other questions relate to the history of the mythology relating to people of African descent in the church and the history of Black members. I read in your introduction about the trilogy novel that you co-authored about the history. And I remember you and I being in Manhattan for the launch of the Freedman Bank records and having you go on CNN National Live News. And I can still remember you sitting up straight and your voice saying, "Our church has a proud history of Black members." Where would you direct people to go for more information about that?
To their neighbors who are persons of color. be a neighbor, be a friend, be a brother. Paraphrasing an article I authored a couple of years ago, Healing the Wounds of Racism. I encourage people to meet the individual, not the race. Greet the person, not the ethnicity. See each and every person, regardless of whomever he or she may be, whatever ethnicity or race or sexual orientation, as indeed a child of God. And so find out what people need. We Latter-day Saints are pretty darn good at talking. I've been doing my share tonight, but we need to be better at listening. We need to pause and hear. So where do we go to find out what's happening with those with whom we need to be more in tune? Listen, go to them. Hey, anything I'm missing? You don't want to make someone a project. No one wants to be a project. But if you want to have someone who is genuinely concerned in your life, you, an individual, then do that. Meet someone and be that friend, that brother, that sister.
Thank you very much. We've exceeded our time by 11 minutes now. I'd like to ask you one more question and then provide you an opportunity to provide a wrap-up statement. And my question is this. I know that this is another experience you and I shared. On the 40th anniversary of the June 1978 revelation on the priesthood, the First Presidency sponsored an event called B1. I can remember you and I sat at a dinner before that event. Can you talk to us about that event, its sponsorship by the First Presidency and the conference center, and what that meant to you personally?
To be there with every member of the Quorum of the 12, and to have that dinner where we could interact with the brethren and their families, and they with our families, to realize how far we had come, because we were the persons of color on a committee, the B1 committee, and we had met over a period of months and worked with the church. And I don't remember a single issue, suggestion that we brought up for that event that was not listened to and incorporated. How about we do X? And it was considered, well, they would ask the question, how would you frame that? How would you do that? There was an openness and a support from the senior brethren. At one point, the question was, well, who should represent the church there, at what level? And it was offered, it ought to be the First Presidency, and the president and prophet of the church ought to be there. Done. And why? Not for our edification, but to signal to the church and to signal to the world. This is serious stuff. We are about our Father's business. The brethren are about our Father's business, and we're going to get this done. I stood all amazed listening to the program that evening after the dinner, going over to the conference center, being so proud to have the stories being told of African converts, of African American converts, of young men, women, children joining the faith and being dedicated to that faith in whatever the constraints they may have encountered individually. To have all of that presented in music, song, that is available out there on the church website, I believe, and maybe elsewhere. I would invite everyone to look for the B1 celebration and get a view of how this church ought to look. And it's varied. There are images of the audience where the camera pans the audience. It is all of the flowers of the field of Father's creation. And we are all happy and having a glorious time the way it ought to be.
Thank you for responding to that. So now your wrap-up statement.
My wrap-up statement. I haven't done this in a long time, remembering these events and times and circumstances. And it is not painful, but difficult in so many ways. But my wrap-up is this. I am Darius Gray. I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I have a testimony that we share in the restored gospel of Christ, that it is open, that gospel, to all of humankind, that we are indeed the offspring of heavenly parents, and that we can be better today than we are, or better tomorrow than we are today. And that is a challenge and charge to us. We ought to approach it with joy, because there is great joy to be had. I bear testimony of this restored gospel, and do so in the name of my Redeemer, my Savior, my Master, Jesus Christ.
Thank you very much. Thank you for tuning into tonight's conversation on the June 1978 revelation on the priesthood, which is official declaration 2 in the Doctrine and Covenants of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We especially want to thank Darius Gray for joining us this evening to relate his personal history, which is an important part of the history of the church. As we close, we want to remind you again of the January 2nd, 2022 conversation on the Garden of Eden with Dr. Tamar Frankiel, an Orthodox Jew and former provost of the Academy for Jewish Religion, California. We hope you'll tune in for that event. Finally, we invite you to review tonight's conversation and previous ones by accessing the John A. Widtsoe Foundation website, www.widtsoefoundation.org. Thank you for listening, and good night.
Thank you.